screen, and screen two, and you should see it in a second. All right, you should see a bunch of worms. So I try to maybe convey to you a little bit about what you need to know about these jumping worms. Yeah, they're sometimes known as snake worms and crazy snake worms, but we're not allowed to do that anymore. So we have to call them jumping worms. We don't want to give other things bad names. Anyway, I'm here on behalf of the University of Vermont, but also on behalf of the Healthy Soil Collaborative, which is an organization that was founded just last year after a lot of hard work. And our mission is basically to bring together researchers, industry, land trusts, regulators, backyard gardeners to solve a problem, which is the invasive earthworms in general, but jumping worms in particular. And we hope to bring back healthy soil to areas that have been invaded so that we can grow ecosystems from the ground up. So that's the Healthy Soil Collaborative. So a lot of people say, hey, Joseph, what do you actually do, right? So I talk to earthworms and I talk to gardeners a lot. So here's, what the earthworms say. They go boo. And then another one quietly says, don't upset the gardeners. And that's why I have to talk to gardeners and folks like you online, because, it's a severe problem. And you probably know this American Gothic painting. But, Nan is really upset, and she wants those worms gone, and talks to Byron, and he says, yep, Nan, I sharpened the pitchforks, ready to go. And unfortunately, that's not going to do it, right? So you can sharpen your pitchforks for other reasons, maybe, but not for the worms. It doesn't really work well. So what are some of the things we can do? And this is what we get to maybe towards the end of, definitely towards the end of this talk. You should know something about how soil ecologists look at global distribution of invasive organisms. And in this case, we're looking at earthworms. There's about 13 families of earthworms, and they're distributed in a particular way, right? So we have all these tectonic plates, and they tend to have their own earthworm fauna. We are looking at, when we're talking about jumping worms, we're talking about this group 3. They're called megascolecids or Megascolecidae. That's the name of the family. And you find them everywhere except for Antarctica. So we like to call them cosmopolitan species. In some places, they don't do all that much harm, but in other places like North America, harm that they do has been documented pretty well. We have 3 jumping worms that we're really, really concerned about. There's Metaphyra hilgendorfi. That's the biggest one. It has like a lighter underside. It usually pinches off its tail when you touch it. And it's the biggest one of them. So it says here 109 to 17, 179, 170 millimeters, and that's about 7 inches, but they get larger than that. The next smaller one is Amynthus agrestis, and then Amynthus tokiensis, which is the smallest one here in New England. And if you go across to Canada, where there's new populations of Amynthus tokiensis being detected, they're much larger. So they're much more like Amynthus agrestis. So you can't always go by the size of them to identify them. But generally, here in New England, it's like Metaphyra hilgendorfi is the biggest one, then Amynthus agrestis, the next one, and then Amynthus tokiensis is the smallest of them. Where precisely are they from, right? So I showed you that image of the world, and it showed that they're pretty much everywhere, right? But originally, they're from Japan and Korea. So from about 30 degrees north to 45 degrees north on those islands, and also in Korea. In North America, they've been detected also along those latitudes, like 27. We have 27 north to 45 north in 37 US states. And now for the past few years, maybe 4 years, they've been detected in 4 provinces in Canada. So that they're pushing north as the climate is warming these areas. So the take home is they're not just tropical worms, as some people think. They're actually worms that are pretty generalist. They can be subtropical all the way up to cold winter type places. So the history of earthworm invasions in North America is really interesting. So before Europeans arrived in North America, there was areas that were pretty devoid of earthworms, and that had to do with that there was a big glaciation until about 12,000 years ago, and the extent of that glaciation is shown in the blue on the map of North America on the left-hand side there. So the blue area is where the last glaciers were of the last ice age, and there was no native earthworms when Europeans arrived, and they brought with them the first earthworm invaders. So we call that the first wave of invasion. And they came basically on boats, of course. They didn't have airplanes yet, but the boats were laden down with ballast, which was usually soil, and that soil contained earthworms and their cocoons. So south of this blue area, there were and there still are native earthworms. So how did they move around? How did they move around after they got to the ports? And a lot of that had to do with horticulture. Nowadays, horticulture is probably the most important way that things are moved around, but also the bait trade. Canada provides a lot of night crawlers to U.S. fishermen, and they're also invasive. And then finally, there's also composting and vermicomposting that are big vectors. That's a big vector of these worms on the continent itself. So the second wave is the invasion by the earthworms that we are talking about today, and they're from Far Eastern Asia. Anecdotally, they are supposed to have arrived with the cherry blossom trees from Japan, and then the first batch of them where that batch was not phytosanitized, and so people think that that's the first time they arrived on the east coast of the U.S. But they had been reported from the West Coast, different species, but they've been reported from the West Coast much earlier in the 1860s. And that sort of correlates with, the time that Matthew Perry opened up trade with Japan again, sort of terminated the isolation of Japan from the West. And so trade seems to be one way that these worms get around a lot. Trade across the oceans, horticulture primarily. Nowadays, that's a lot better controlled through phytosanitation laws. So, for example, you cannot bring in plants with roots unless you have a license for. With roots, you can bring them with roots, but not soil unless you have a license for it. So why do we care? So aren't earthworms gardeners' best friends? Joe was talking about this earlier, saying, hey, there's something wrong with this. Gardeners really like earthworms, right? So if you have earthworms, you're doing a good thing. But nowadays, gardeners are kind of freaked out by these worms. They're reporting damage to plants because of these worms. Whether that is actually true is another question. My wife is a horticulturist and said, yeah, right. It might just be that they're managing their beds the wrong way, right? So it could be that. And one of the things that is important to know is that, there isn't all that much research on this because research is expensive, and the federal government or even state governments just doesn't provide the funds for research on earthworms, which are good, right? Earthworms good, street credibility. When some of these earthworms are actually bad for the gardens and for agriculture and for forest ecosystems. Anyway, so the first documented negative effects of European earthworms, this when people started thinking about earthworms as invasive, were in the late 1950s when in Canada, northern parts of Canada, they drastically altered soils from something that looked like this. See an auger picture here of an uncontaminated soil from uninvaded soil from earthworm invaded invasions, and you see a really good duff layer right here. There's a lighter brown color into a darker organic horizon, and then into this lighter color. It's called an albic horizon or the E horizon, into something that is kind of dark orange brown. This is a spodosol, and this is typical for the northern parts of North America. You see a lot of them here in Vermont, but you see even more of them in Canada. And so this kind of soil was altered to look more like this, where everything is homogenized. And the soil scientists in Canada at that time were kind of saying, hey, these earthworms do really do a job on our soils, right? So we have to start thinking about this a little bit. So these changes in soil health make for big ecosystem effects, right? So here's the depiction of an ecological cascade that's caused by earthworm invasions, and this image comes from Froelich et al. So Lee Froelich is a big guy, a big earthworm guy in Minnesota. Anyway, so earthworms change the soil structure. They change the density of the soil. They change the organic horizons. They consume some of that organic material, and so with that, they change the cycles of nutrients in the soil. That change soil temperature, that change soil moisture, and all that changes the microbial processes and the soil food web, which then in turn changes the habitat of plants and habitat of vertebrate and invertebrate species, and all that has an effect on the plant community. And this is what we call a microcascade. It happens in place where the earthworms were, and then there's the macrocascade, which now these changes now have effects on other invasive species that might come in. Plant community, I already said that, disease dynamics, also fire dynamics, soil and water quality, etc. So there's bigger effects that come with this, and we all have to start thinking about these invasions not as some kind of cavalier sort of invasion that happens and we have some more earthworms. We have to think about that this is actually costing people money. This is costing society money. So here's an effect that's really interesting. Huge storm in July 2024. These pictures are from Montpelier in Vermont. And what you see here are this is the same slope, huge amount of jumping worms here. What you don't see anymore is the topsoil, which was all these castings that are produced by jumping worms. They make these tiny little castings that are very loose and erodible, and you notice these erosion channels, huge amount of soil being moved, and it ended up down in the north branch of the Winooski River. The castings and that soil that's been eroded away contain these worms and contain cocoons. They can survive in water. So the Winooski River probably took some of these organisms to other places, maybe miles away. There's an effect on the regeneration of sugar and red maple. If you look at ferritomoids, these are the jumping worms. Very few saplings in those forests. If you look at the common nightcrawler, Lumbrix terrestris, you've got a few more. And if there's no earthworms, you have a lot more saplings. So the regeneration of sugar and red maple. OMG here in Vermont, we like our sugar maple. Trouble at mill, right? So not good. And there's other effects that people have discovered, effects on vegetation, effects on invertebrates that fuel some or that drive some of the decomposition processes that we need for healthy soils. All these things are happening in these invaded areas. Here's the cost of biological invasions. If you look at the cost of storms, this is this gray thing for over 20 years. I think it was 1980 to 2090, so 40 years of damage. Storms, $1.9 trillion in storm damage over that period of time. Biological invasions, this green thing, 1.2 trillion. So it's not it's not a trivial amount of damage, and that's only the damage that economists could come up with. There might be other damage that we haven't seen and assessed. And the damage is increasing. So on the left-hand side, you see the cost of these damaging events: storm, biological invasions, drought, flood, etc. From 1980 to 2019. This is the change. So we went from some very small amounts, this darker color red here, versus this entire bar. That represents an increase in change of 15-fold, so 1,500 times more damage detected in biological invasion than in the previous decade. Okay, so invaders generally have a really hard time to establish. There's many barriers for them to do this. So probably quite a few things that are introduced are probably never seeing the light of day in where they were introduced. Then there's invasion failures all along from when they're being transported all the way to when they start spreading profusely across the landscape or across the continent. So at each one of these barriers, so geography is the first barrier, right? So how do they get across the ocean, right? Most of earthworms, there are some that can travel on across the oceans by themselves on pieces of wood or coconuts or something like that. But most of them can't do this. And the worms that we're talking about definitely can't do that. So phytosanitation, trade barriers for horticultural goods basically will stop these things. Then you have introduction into captivity or cultivation into nice environments where they might persist. But if you were to put them into nature, so going from greenhouses, for example, where there might be going into nature, maybe too cold, maybe the growing season is too short. They may not survive until they adapt, right? And then they survive, or until the environment changes and then they survive. And will they reproduce? So all along this way, there's barriers. There's barriers all the way to the end where they become endemic and trouble. So there should be ways of us being able to take care of them. And so the other thing that's really important about invasive species and the cost that goes with controlling them is the fact that the sooner you catch it, the cheaper it is, the more bang for the buck you get for the control interventions that you make. Like prevention, passing a law that says you cannot bring soil into the country or onto the continent, that's probably really cheap. So for every buck you spend on that, you get $100 back. As the earthworms are spreading and occupying more area, it becomes more expensive. Right? So here's the species curve. So prevention is the species is not there yet. The species arrives, and now you're talking about eradication. Right? You want to eradicate or contain those worms in our case, and that becomes more expensive. Containment is more expensive, and then if they become more established in the environment, then you're talking about long-term control where you have to keep putting money into the system in order to maintain the ecosystem that you're trying to protect. And that becomes expensive. So let's talk a little bit about jumping worm biology, because I think that's really important to understand before we start talking about controlling them. So the first adults, where do you want to start, with the cocoons or the adults? Chicken or egg? Let's start with the egg, right? So each adult produces about 60 cocoons in a season. The cocoons are winter hardy, so there's also they're also survival structures. During the winter and into the spring, the embryos develop, and then some of those cocoons will hatch, and you find the first surviving hatchlings in mid-April. And I'm saying that some of these hatch, and you will know why I say that in a minute. So the first surviving was seen in mid-April, and then in July, August, you see the first adults, and they start producing the cocoons, and so the cycle continues. Uh, Not all of these cocoons hatch, as I said, and so there is probably a cocoon bank building up in the soil. And that might lead to actually, at some point, to these blooms of hatchlings coming about, right? So let's have a look at sort of the typical phenology of these worms. I already said, beginning of April, you see the first hatchlings that survive, and then after that, things become pretty variable from one year to the next. So there was one year in 2019 where we had a huge amount of individuals hatching, and that might be due to the fact that maybe a big cocoon bank might have built up, and so in that year we had favorable conditions for hatching, and they just hatched at great numbers because there's all these cocoons from previous years that didn't hatch. But that doesn't happen every year, right? So some years you have this peak, a really high peak in around mid-May. Some years you have a lower peak of hatchlings sometime in June. Sometimes it stretches right into July for the peak abundance of hatchlings. So that's the first phase, right? The second phase is that the adults emerge, and that can happen anytime between beginning of July and mid-August. And after that, it's a downward spiral. So at the end of August, we might have the first frosts here in Vermont and across the way in the Adirondacks, and there's a sharp decline in the number of individual worms that we see in the forest. So this is all for forest. I should say that very quickly. They might get a little bit of an increase. Maybe there's some counting errors or something like that, and then we get the continuous decrease into December, and most of the worms are done. In most years, they're all done by December 2nd or 3rd. Sometimes you find some in January in warm winters here in Vermont, but they don't look so well when they get to January. They've gone through a lot by that time. So that is sort of the way they vary over time. So during the season, but also between years. So that's something to remember when you're thinking about trying to control these worms. How do they change from year to year, and what is the change over a year? So the other thing that's important is this hatching phenology, right? So we have this really cool had this really cool experiment. My colleague Mariam Nourian did this experiment where her hypothesis was that they come from Japan. They probably have a little clock that tells them when to hatch, and so if they come from Japan, then likely the time to hatch for them is in the springtime, because if they hatched in the fall, then they would be getting into the Japanese winter, which can be just as harsh as over here, and they would all die before they even reach adulthood and reproduce. So that's one side of it. So they have a clock that says as of February 28th, all the way through whenever. Get ready to jump out of that cocoon on February 29th to February 28th. If it's too cold, they're not going to come out. If it's too warm, they're not going to come out. They really only hatch around 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So you need a spring where you have these temperatures, and most of New England has 10 degrees or 50 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures in the springtime, right? So they will hatch. Once it gets above 20, they don't hatch anymore. They just stay put. There's no point for them to hatch, because if it gets too hot, maybe they're not going to make it. And we've seen this in the field. So what you see here is number of hatchlings on this axis, on the y-axis, and the x-axis is dates, and the temperature variation is shown on the right-hand side y-axis. You see these dots. Those are the number of hatchlings per square meter that we see through the seasons. Notice that it's kind of trailing off as you go through the summer, but there's like a big pickup in hatchlings around April into May. And that's the time when the temperature actually stays in a temperature range where these worms can hatch. In the fall, even though you go through the same kind of temperature regime again, they don't hatch anymore. They just don't like to hatch in the fall because of that timer that they got that inherited from Japan. So the challenge of controlling jumping worms is to control the earthworms themselves. And as you notice, there can be up to 300 juveniles per square meter in the springtime. But you also want to control the very hardy cocoons. And you're talking about 1,000 to 2,000 cocoons per square meter. So roughly 100 to 200 per square foot. This is again in a forest. And the cocoons basically dry out when conditions are not favorable for them to survive. And so when they dry out, they basically stop any kind of embryo development, but the embryos don't die. So drought and winter, these worms are desiccated. These cocoons are desiccated, and they remoisten when it gets warmer or when the drought is over. And so that's how they survive. This is a very typical strategy in biology that at least smaller things like these embryos and nematodes and protozoa, they can dry out and survive adverse conditions. Right. So the first thing for what can we do, right, is prevention. We want to stop them from getting into North America, or being reintroduced. So, or they're already here, right? So the other side of this is you don't want to bring them onto your property, right? So you don't want to move those things around. I already mentioned a couple of times when how they were moving, like horticulture, compost, and the bait trade. So phytosanitation is a fine thing for preventing the introduction, right? So there's federal laws that say you cannot bring soil into the country. That is probably stopping jumping worms and other things, unless you have a license, and unless they come here for Canada. You can bring in soil as long as it doesn't come from an area where there is an invasive species, right? So you can bring soil in, no problem, as long as there's no invasive species. The problem is people don't recognize that earthworms are invasive species, right? And earthworms, good, they're part of the ecosystem. How can they be invasive? How can they be bad? So there's one loophole, and there's other loopholes as well. But other things you can do with your personal property, buy bare root plants, or if you can't get bare root plants, wash the roots. I think that every nursery should have a root washing station where you can take that off. Of course, that is not true, but make sure that if you buy stuff or you put stuff in the ground, it's bare root, or grow stuff from seed. That's another possibility of keeping these worms out of your property. For people that manage natural areas, they might have some kind of boot cleaning areas so that the hikers that go through there don't bring these cocoons of earthworms on their boots into the natural area. I've always been sort of a friend of organic recycling laws. I like the idea that we close the loop, but there's risks with that, like contaminated horticultural materials. Like if you have if you're a horticultural enterprise and you make your own potting mix with your own compost, then likely you might have some worm cocoons in that. Here's an example of what happened to Gretchen. So this is an email I got from a master gardener volunteer that they get questions. And so Gretchen has a large vegetable garden in East Calais, Vermont, and she purchased bags of reducted compost and they spread them in the garden. And she didn't notice worms at the time. But the following year, the garden was full of large aggressive worms, blah, blah, blah. There turned out to be some kind of a Memphis worm, so it's some kind of jumping worm. She called them aggressive and active and intelligent, and the telltale flick of the tail gave them away. And the master gardener asked whether they had that light band completely circling their body, and she wasn't quite sure whether that was true. But one thing that she found out that when she opened an intact bag of this compost was left over from last year, she found a large worm in it. So compost can move it around. There are some compost companies that now do not take any more leaf mulch from in the fall, because they tend to be one of the ways that these things spread around, right? So here's a place near where I live in St. Albans, and these people are really neat freaks, and they rake their leaves and they put them in brown paper bags and they take them down to the transfer station, and at the transfer station they say, hey, we've got too much leaf mulch, why don't we just give that away? It's kind of cool to give it away, and then it's out of our hair, and sometimes you get it for cheap or for free. Well, guess what, if there's earthworms in there, jumping worms in there, then they go to many places. They come from one place and they go to many places. And so there's that invasion happening in real time. You can solarize compost or leaf mulch. The magic number for heat kill is 40 degrees Celsius or 105 degrees Fahrenheit for the cocoons. And if you leave them out on a hot day, on a couple of hot days, let's use this one here. So this is what I do. I wrap up the compost in painter's plastic sheeting. Usually I use the 2 mil one because it doesn't break down so fast, and I leave it in the sun for a while, 4 days. In this case, it was 4 days, and temperatures were 71 Fahrenheit all the way up to about 95 Fahrenheit. This ambient temperatures, the temperatures that were in that package are given on this y-axis, and you want to look for that 40-degree line right here, right? So after 4 days, even at the very lowest depth, that's the blue line here, the dark blue line, the temperature in that pile was at kill temperature. So you could potentially do that, right? So ideally, you want to talk to your composter where you get it from, and ask whether they have any jumping worms. And usually they tell you. The main problem is probably not the composter, but most likely the reseller of the compost, right? Because that's where invasions can happen again. So if you have a horticultural outfit and they have these worms, many of them have them, they will invade that compost pile that they're reselling from a larger composter. Eradication, what can we do? So chemicals and biological agents. So the first thing that you need to know, the label is the law. Pesticide labels, you need to read them. And here's some tips from the EPA. They're saying, know your pest, find the product that solves the problem, buy the right amount and don't overbuy, pay attention to warnings, use the product in the right way, and prevent harm in the environment. And there's reasons why that is, right? So one is find the product that solves the problem. It has to be certified and efficacious for the pest, otherwise it doesn't work. Pay attention to the warning, human health and safety. Some of these things are nasty. Use the product in the right way. Instructions, read the instructions and use them in that way. Know where to use them and when to use them, right? So those are really important things. And finally, don't do harm to the environment. And also that is also on the label. So what are some of the potential candidates for vermicides? There are some that will receive a lot of scrutiny and some that will receive less scrutiny because they have gone through scrutiny already, right? So the least scrutiny are for EPA listed agents that are minimal risk. So they've already been vetted for environmental and human health. Some states will allow you to use them, but it depends on the state. So call up whoever is in charge of pesticides in the state and ask whether you can use minimal risk, whether the state is on the minimal risk list of states that can use these things. More scrutiny is given to pesticides that have already been vetted for other pests, right? So not jumping worms, but maybe some kind of bug. They've been vetted environmentally, they've been certified for pests and for specific plants. And yeah, you can use them on those pests and those plants, but legally you can't use them on these earthworms. So in some states, you can get this thing called a 2EE exemption of the law, of the pesticide law, and basically the idea is that this pesticide has already been vetted, it's already allowed. You just want to add one more pest to it, for example, jumping worms, right? And in some states that works. In some other states it doesn't. So state laws vary. State laws tend to be more stringent, and so they are oftentimes more prohibitive, even when the exemption by the EPA administrator stands. And then the most scrutiny is substances that never been certified, and so tea tree seed extract is one of them, and it really needs to undergo regulatory certification in order for it to be a legal. I mean, you might apply tea tree seed extract for some other reason, like fertilizer or something like that, and then nobody asks. But as soon as you even think, I'm going to kill these worms with it, it's a pesticide. So you have to really do mind control in order to do this legally, right? So, but we did some preliminary tests, and these tests were done in two different places: University of Minnesota on the left and University of Vermont on the right, with different things. So the rightmost purple bar is tea tree seed meal. This is our standard, right? This is definitely something that kills these worms. We know that it's really efficacious. It's a cool potential pesticide for controlling these worms. The lighter purple one is sodium lauryl sulfate, which is something, laurel with a Y, which is something that is in many soap products, for example, and it's like a saponin, which is the ingredient in the tea tree seed meal that is efficacious. And then there was cedar wood at different levels of concentration. Then it's Botanigard, which is Bovaria bassiana, which is a fungus that has been shown to be effective. And there's Botanigard plus cocoa wet. Cocoa wet is a wetting agent. It allows Botanigard or other fungi to stick to the organisms better. And then we just did cocoa wet. And if you look at these two graphs, the one on the left and the right, you see big differences, right? So in Minnesota, we see that tea tree seed meal and sodium lauryl sulfate have the same kind of mortality rates. The cedar wood is doing relatively pretty much the same in both places. And I think the other really big difference is between the Botanigard with the cocoa wet, right? Really efficacious in Minnesota and not so much in Vermont. And so this is a concern. I'll address it in a second. But I want to point out that there's different classes of pesticide in this preliminary trial, right? So the pesticide law, FIFRA, has minimum risk pesticides listed that you can use in some states. So sodium lauryl sulfate is one of them that's on that list of minimum risk. Cocoa wet is on that list. Cedar oil is on that list, right? So that's why they were taken. Then there's a new uncertified pesticide. It's not really new, but it's uncertified. Is tea tree seed extract. And then previously certified biopesticide, Bovaria bassiana. So that would you could probably get that certified in your state under the 2EE exemption. But you have to talk to the state to do that. And Botanic Art alone or in combination with cocoa wet, both cocoa wet is a minimum risk one, but Botanic Art isn't. So that would also count as a uncertified pesticide for jumping worms. All right. So trials with Botanic Art, and I'm going to get back to why maybe there's differences in mortality rates between Minnesota and Vermont in a second. I want to show you this first, though. So trial with Botanic Art a long time ago, maybe 6 years ago now. My grad student Mariam and Nurain, who's now a research professor here at the university, did the first real test on jumping worms for eradication, right? So she said, I'm gonna work with a entomopathogenic fungus, so something that kills insects, because I think that she thought that was a really good way to go. This is something that's already killing something, and so maybe it is also effective on earthworms. And so on the left-hand side, you see efficaciousness of that Bovaria bassiana at about 80%, right? So these tall things are essentially the trials with Bovaria bassiana in different forms. We mycotized some of them with millet. So we mycotized millet to have a more stable product when we applied it to soil. And then we had just millet to look at, right? So, okay. Moving on from young juveniles, this is what this trial was done on, to pre-adults, so much larger worms. And right off the bat, you see that mortality has dropped from 80% down to somewhere around 15 to 20%, regardless of what you were using. So the older the worms, the harder it is to kill them. Just in case you wonder what millet, what mycotized millet looks like, it looks like that. So the fungus grew on the millet. The other question, then we said, oh, well, that seems to work on the juveniles. I wonder whether it works on the cocoons. So we tried to infect cocoons with Botanic Art, and we only achieved something like 20 to 25% mortality rate. So cocoons protect the embryo much better than the soil does the worms, right? So there's still greater mortality, and maybe as part of your treatment, this might be one of the ways that you combine different eradication treatments. Trial with certified chemical pesticides, so Sevin and T-Bird, so chemicals. 81%, 82% mortality, and then for teat seed meal extracts, 11%. So how does that jive with this and with that, right? So really good question. So I'm sure I have. So what is the best life stage, right? So it could be that you're looking at larger life stages in this trial, and the same. Maybe there was a difference in life stage in Minnesota versus Vermont, right? So we might have had bigger worms, and therefore our worms might have progressed further along their life and the life cycle than in Minnesota. That might have caused that difference. So it's really important. Again, the timing that you put on the label will be really important for the efficaciousness of these things. Questions we do have after these tests: what is the best life stage to apply? So that's, or that variation that we saw, that might be due to that. That goes on the label. Time of application. Best way to apply the pesticide. What is the formulation? Are you using this Botanic Art, or are you using mycotized millet? What is the method of application? Do you incorporate it into the soil, or do you leave it at the top? What are the off-target effects? Label, place, critters, and plants. who is affected? How long does the pesticide stay in the soil? What is its fate? So that should go on the label as an environmental issue. Here's the slide I've shown you earlier. Variability in mortality, growth stage of the jumping worm, age of the product used, especially for the biologicals, and how and where was it applied in the different places. So best time to apply might be before these worms reach adulthood, when they can produce these resistant cocoons. And maybe it should be when the most juveniles are out. So juveniles are good because they die more readily than the adults or the pre-juveniles. So maybe you want to hit them at this sometime between the middle of May and the middle of June, when the hatchlings are most abundant. Plants must also survive, right? So I said off-target stuff should be on the label. So we did some work with soap just before we discovered lauryl sulfate. I have two panels here. One shows you the mean mortality of these worms. So adults on the mortality on the left-hand side, and there's two panels in that as well. So the top is how many of the worms have made it into adulthood, and how many survived, right? So if you look at the soap, it's really good. It prevents them from becoming adults, and it kills them as well. I mean, they're not all dead, so the remainder doesn't become adult. Let's put it that way. On the right-hand side of this panel, you see the effect on plant growth above ground, so length of the plant, and the root length. Looking at soap again, right? So soap really, really good at killing the worms and maintaining them as juveniles. But when you look at the above ground growth of the plants, it's much lower than for any of the other treatments that are not as efficacious. And the root length is also stunted, right? So soap may not be, at least not at the concentration we used, may not be the best treatment for this. So you have to consider the plant as well. You don't want to kill something that you want to protect, right? So there's the problem. Heat treatments, cocoons and worms. So I already told you about solarizing compost, right? Worms survive between 40 Fahrenheit and 100 Fahrenheit, and cocoons survive between -40 and 104 Fahrenheit, right? So very cold hardy survival structures. Heat treatments that are available, salt solarization, not always effective. You want to solarize drier soils because then heat is transmitted deeper into the soil. Use plastic sheeting for that. And agriculturists use this for killing cover crops or killing weeds. There's also salt steaming. That's costly, right? So that thing costs you a lot of money. But there are some places so this image is from the Southern Rhode Island Conservation District, that I think has one of these things that you can, and some of the extension services have one of these, and they like to use them on high quality crop land, so or in high tunnels, where where these things are most efficient. So jumping worms, you notice, are a very complex problem. You need to get a handle on their spread. You need to know what their impact is. You need to control them. You have to find some kind of controlling agents or controlling methods. And you may also want to think about restoring the soil and maybe the ecosystems that are affected, right? So the spread, you're talking about identifying regions of risk. You want to, if you do control, you want to maybe target those first, right? You want to target the ones that are at highest risk. Impact and control, really important for certification. So if you talk to, so certification has to be done either by a company that produces pesticides or by interest groups that have an interest in controlling the worms. So you can get that certification, but you have to pay money for it. And if you pay money for it, you want to know whether there's any return on your investment, right? So you want to know, what is the impact? where are these worms? Are these worms widespread? Will I be able to sell enough of the pesticide in order to make money? And then finally, I mean, before you can even treat anything, you need to know what the control is. That will tell you who the company is. And then you have to talk to the company and see whether they want to have the EPA certify the product. So complicated, right? So you have to involve a lot of people in this: regulators, horticultural trade, industry, but also other stakeholders like landowners, homeowners, botanical gardens, etc. Compost companies. A lot of people have to be involved, and so that's why we founded the Healthy Soil Collaborative, because we want to work together to stop those invasive jumping worms and save our gardens, our forests, etc. This is the landing page, and so this gardens thing is going to rotate around a bunch of ecosystems. The reason why we founded this because it is really difficult to get money for this kind of research, which is really important, but earthworms have street credibility, except for with those people that are affected by it. So we're hoping that eventually we're going to get a lot of donations from people so that we can do this research. We're a group of about 15 researchers at 8 institutions, and we're collaborating with a bunch of different organizations to make this happen. Okay, with that, I'm going to ask you to ask me questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gorres. That was great. I mean, this is such an unknown to most people. We don't think of worms as invasive. And this was extremely helpful.